Today I invite you to listen to the French drama Mademoiselle Fifi, written by Guy de Maupassant in 1882. Mademoiselle Fifi. The Major, Count von Falsberg, commander of the Prussian detachment, was finishing reading the mail that had been brought to him. He sat in a wide carpet chair, his feet raised on the elegant marble board of the fireplace, where his spurs, the Earl had been in the castle of Heuville for 3 months, had hollowed out a couple of notable potholes that deepened every day. A cup of coffee was smoking on a round table, the mosaic board of which was drenched in liquor, burned with cigars, cut with a penknife. Having finished repairing the pencil sometimes, the conquering officer, having nothing better to do, began to scratch numbers and drawings on the precious furniture. After reading the letters and looking over the German newspapers brought by the postman, the Count got up, threw 3 or 4 thick logs, still damp, into the fireplace. These gentlemen were gradually cutting down the park for firewood, and went to the window. The rain poured down in torrents. It was the Norman rain, as if poured out by an angry hand, a slanting rain, thick as a curtain, a rain like a wall of sloping strips, lashing, splashing mud, flooding everything, the real rain of the environs of Rouen, that night pot of France. The officer looked for a long time at the waterlogged lawns and into the distance at the swollen and overflowing Andel. He was drumming his fingers on the glass, tapping some Rhine waltz, when suddenly a noise behind him made him turn around. His assistant, Baron von Kelwingstein, whose rank corresponded to our rank of captain, had arrived. The Major was of enormous height, broad-shouldered, with a long fan-shaped beard that fell over his chest like a tablecloth. His whole tall, solemn figure evoked the idea of a peacock, a military peacock with its tail unfurled under its chin. He had blue, cold and calm eyes, a scar on his cheek from a saber blow received during the war with Austria, and he was reputed not only a brave officer, but also a good man. The captain, small, red-faced, with a large, tightly stretched belly, cut his red beard short. In a certain light it acquired a fiery sheen, and then it seemed that his face was rubbed with phosphorus. He was missing 2 teeth that had been knocked out on the night of the revelry. He did not remember how it had happened, and he lisped and spat out words that could not always be understood. On the top of his head he had a bald patch, like a monk's tonsure. A fleece of short, curly hair, golden and shiny, framed this circle of naked flesh. The commander shook his hand and drank a cup of coffee, the 6th of the morning, in one breath while listening to his subordinates report on the incidents on duty. Then they went to the window and confessed to each other that they were not having fun. The Major, a calm man who had a family in his native land, adapted himself to everything, but the captain, a notorious reveler, a habitué of brothels and a desperate skirt, was infuriated by the enforced chastity of 3 months in this remote camp. Someone knocked softly on the door, and the commander shouted, "Come in." His appearance meant that breakfast was served. In the dining room they found 3 junior officers, Lieutenant Otto von Grossling and 2 second lieutenants, Fritz Scheinerberg and Marquis Wilhelm von Eyrick, a small blonde, haughty and rude to men, cruel to the vanquished and hot-tempered as gunpowder. From the moment he entered France, his comrades called him Mademoiselle Fifi. He owed this nickname to his coquettish appearance, to his thin, corseted face, with a scarcely pierced mustache, and to his habit of using every moment, in order to express the highest contempt for people and things, the French words fi donc, which he pronounced with a slight whistle. The dining room at the Château de Heuville was a long, regally magnificent room, its antique mirrors, all star-shaped with bullet cracks, and the tall Flanders tapestries on the walls, shattered by the blows of the saber and here and there hanging in rags, testified to Mademoiselle Fifi's occupations in her leisure hours. The 3 family portraits on the walls, the armored warrior, the cardinal, and the president of the court, were now smoking long porcelain pipes, and a noble lady in a narrow corsage was haughtily displaying a huge charcoal-painted mustache from a gilded frame. The officers' breakfast passed almost silently. The room, disfigured and half-dark from the downpour, was depressing by the sight of the conquered place, and its old oak parquet was covered with mud like the floor in a tavern. When they had finished their meal and turned to wine and smoking, they began to complain of boredom, as was the custom every day. Bottles of cognac and liqueurs passed from hand to hand. Lying on their chairs, the officers were incessantly sipping their wine, keeping in their mouths the long, curved pipes with an earthenware egg at the end, variegated as if to tempt the. As soon as the glasses were emptied, the officers filled them again with a submissive and tired look. But Mademoiselle Fifi broke his glass every time, and the soldier immediately handed him another. A corrosive tobacco mist enveloped them, and they seemed to sink deeper and deeper into the drowsy and sad intoxication, into the sullen intoxication of people who had nothing to do. But suddenly the Baron jumped up. Trembling with rage, he shouted, "Hell! This cannot go on. We must finally come up with something." Lieutenant Otto and Second Lieutenant Fritz, both with typical German faces, motionless and thoughtful, asked with one voice, "What is it, Captain?" He thought for a minute, then said, What? If the commander allows, we must have a feast." The major took the pipe out of his mouth. "What feast, Captain?" The Baron approached him. "I'll take care of all the trouble, Mr. Major. I will be sent by me to Rouen and will bring the ladies with him. I know where to get them. They'll cook dinner, we've got everything for that, and at least we'll have a nice evening." Count von Falsberg smiled, shrugging his shoulders. "You're crazy, my friend." But the officers jumped up from their seats, surrounded the commander and begged, "Allow the captain, chief. It's so dull here." At last the major yielded, saying, "Well, all right," and the Baron immediately sent for Obey. He was an old non-commissioned officer. He never smiled, but fanatically carried out all the orders of his superiors, whatever they were. Stretching himself out, he listened impassively to the Baron's instructions, then went out, and 5 minutes later 4 horses were galloping in the pouring rain on a huge wagon cart with a tarpaulin stretched over it in the form of a vault. At once everything seemed to awaken. The languid figures straightened up, the faces became animated, and everyone began to chatter. Although the downpour continued with the same fury, the major announced that it was lighter, and Lieutenant Otto confidently asserted that the sky would now clear. Mademoiselle Fifi himself seemed to be unable to sit still. He got up and sat down again. His bright, hard eyes were looking for something to break. Suddenly, fixing his eyes on the mustachioed lady, the young blonde man took out a revolver. "You won't see it," he said, and without getting up he took aim. 2 bullets, one after the other, pierced the eyes in the portrait. Then he shouted, "Let's lay a mine." And the conversation ceased in an instant, as if some new and exciting interest had taken hold of the attention of all present. The mine was his invention, his method of destruction, his favorite pastime. Leaving the castle, its owner, Count Fernand d'Aumont de Heuville, did not have time to take with him or hide anything but silver, immured in the recess of one wall. And since he was rich and fond of art, the large drawing room, which opened into the dining room, was a veritable gallery of the museum until the owner's hasty flight. Expensive canvases, drawings and watercolors hung on the walls. On tables and cupboards, on shelves and in elegant shop windows, there were many trinkets, Chinese vases, figurines of Saxon porcelain, Chinese freaks, old ivory and Venetian glass inhabited the huge room with their precious and quaint crowd. Now there is almost nothing left of all this. It wasn't that things had been looted. Major Count von Falsberg would never have allowed that, but Mademoiselle Fifi would plant a mine from time to time, and on days like that all the officers would really have fun for a few minutes. The little Marquis went into the drawing room in search of what he wanted. He brought a tiny teapot made of Chinese porcelain, the Pink family, poured gunpowder into it, carefully inserted a long piece of tinder through the spout, set it on fire, and ran away to the next room. Then he instantly returned and locked the door behind him. All the Germans waited, standing, with a smile of childish curiosity on their faces, and as soon as the explosion shook the walls of the castle, a crowd rushed into the living room. Mademoiselle Fifi, who had entered first, clapped his hands furiously at the sight of the terracotta Venus, whose head had fallen off at last. Each picked up pieces of porcelain, marveling at the strange shape of the fractures caused by the explosion, considering new damages and arguing about some as the result of previous explosions. The major looked with a fatherly glance around the huge hole destroyed, as if by the will of Nero, by this grape shot and strewn with fragments of works of art. He came out first, good-naturedly declaring, "This time very successfully." But in the dining room, where it was heavily smoked, such a column of smoke burst in that it became difficult to breathe. The major threw open the window. The officers, who had returned to finish their last glasses of cognac, also went to the window. The room was filled with humid air, which brought with it a cloud of water spray that settled on the beards. The officers looked at the tall trees that drooped in the rain, at the wide valley gloomy with low black clouds, and at the distant church bell tower, towering like a gray arrow in the pouring rain. As soon as the Prussians arrived, this bell tower was no longer ringing. This, however, was the only resistance encountered by the conquerors in this region. The cure did not in the least refuse to take in and feed the Prussian soldiers. He even agreed more than once to drink a bottle of beer or Bordeaux with the enemy's commander, who often resorted to his benevolent mediation, but there was no need to ask him to ring the bell even once. He would rather allow himself to be shot. It was his personal way of protesting against the invasion, a protest by silence, a peaceful and only protest, which, according to him, befitted a priest, a bearer of meekness and not enmity. For 10 leagues in the district, everyone praised the firmness and heroism of the Abbé Chantevoine, who had dared to establish popular mourning by the obstinate silence of his church. The whole village, inspired by this resistance, was ready to support its pastor to the end, to go to any lengths. She considered such a silent protest to be the salvation of the people's honor. It seemed to the peasants that they had rendered no less service to their country than Belfort and Strasbourg, that they had set the same example of patriotism, and that the name of their village would be immortalized. However, apart from this, they did not refuse anything to the victorious Prussians. The commander and officers laughed at this harmless courage, but as they were treated with courtesy and obedience throughout the country, they willingly put up with such a silent expression of patriotism. Only the little Marquis Wilhelm wanted to make the bell ring at all costs. He was angry at his superior's diplomatic condescension, and every day begged him to allow him to ring ding-dong-dong once, just for fun. He asked for it with the grace of a cat, with the insinuation of a woman, with the gentle voice of a lover clouded by desire. But the major did not yield, and Mademoiselle Fifi, for his consolation, laid mines in the castle of Heuville. For several minutes, all 5 stood in a group at the window, breathing in the humid air. Finally, Lieutenant Fritz, laughing rudely, said, "These deficiencies have had a bad frame for their profiling." Then each went about his business, and the captain had a lot of trouble to prepare dinner. When they met again in the evening, they could not help laughing as they looked at each other. They were all lipsticked, perfumed, dressed up, and dazzled as in the days of great parades. The major's hair was not as grey as it had been in the morning, and the captain had shaved, leaving only his mustache burning under his nose. In spite of the rain, the window was left open. Every now and then someone came up to him and listened. At 7:10, the Baron reported the distant rattle of wheels. Everyone rushed to the window, and soon a huge wagon pulled by 4 fast-speeding horses flew into the courtyard. They were spattered with mud up to their backs, smoking with sweat and snoring. And on the porch came 5 women, 5 beautiful girls, carefully selected by the captain's comrade, to whom Obidiu went with his officer's visiting card. They did not force themselves to ask, knowing beforehand that they would be well paid. In 3 months they had become acquainted with the Prussians and reconciled themselves to them, as well as to the state of affairs in general. "This is what our trade demands," they assured themselves on the way, no doubt trying to drown out the secret reproaches of some remnant conscience. At once they entered the dining room. In the light it seemed still more gloomy in its deplorable devastation, and the table, set with viands, expensive dishes, and silver found in the wall where the owner of the castle had hidden it, gave the room the appearance of a tavern where bandits dine after a robbery. The captain, all beaming, at once took possession of the women as his usual possessions. He examined them, embraced them, sniffed them, determined their value as priestesses of merriment, and when the three young men wanted to choose a lady for themselves, he imperiously stopped them, intending to divide them himself, according to rank, in all justice, so as not to violate the hierarchy in any way. In order to avoid all disputes, wrangling, and suspicions of partiality, he lined them up in a row, according to their height, and addressed the tallest, as if commanding. "What is your name?" "Pamela," she answered, trying to speak louder. And he declared, "Number 1, Pamela, is awarded to the commander." Then he embraced the second, the blonde, as a sign of appropriation, and offered the fat Amanda to Lieutenant Otto, Eva, nicknamed Tomato, to Second Lieutenant Fritz, and the smallest of all, the Jewess Rachel, a young brunette with eyes as black as ink spots, with an upturned nose that did not confirm the rule that all Jews are hook-nosed, to the youngest of the officers, the frail Marquis Wilhelm von Eyrick. All the women, however, were beautiful and stout. They differed little from each other in face, and on account of their daily love-making and common life in the brothel, they resembled each other in manners and complexion. The three young men wanted to take their women upstairs at once, under the pretext of giving them a bath and a cleanse, but the captain wisely opposed this, asserting that they were neat enough to sit down at table, and that the officers who went upstairs with them would probably want to exchange ladies when they came down, which would upset the other couples. His worldly experience prevailed. They limited themselves to numerous kisses, kisses of expectation. Suddenly Rachel almost choked, coughing to tears and blowing smoke from her nostrils. The Marquis, under the pretext of a kiss, let a stream of tobacco smoke into her mouth. She did not get angry, did not say a word, but stared at her owner, and anger flashed in the depths of her black eyes. They sat down at the table. The commander himself seemed to be delighted. To his right he seated Pamela, to his left blonde, and announced, unfolding the napkin, "You've had a delightful idea, Captain." Lieutenants Otto and Fritz, who behaved with great politeness as if they were ladies of the world, embarrassed their neighbors by this. But Baron von Kelwingstein, feeling himself in his own sphere, beamed, poured out ambiguous witticisms, and with his cap of fiery red hair seemed to be engulfed in flames. He was courteous in Rhine French, and his tavern compliments, spat out through the hole of 2 knocked-out teeth, reached the girls with a splash of saliva. The girls, however, did not understand anything, and their consciousness seemed to be awakened only at the moment when the Baron began to spew obscene words and obscenities, which were also distorted by his pronunciation. Then they began to laugh like madmen, throwing themselves on the bellies of their neighbors and repeating the Baron's expressions, which he deliberately distorted to make them talk greasy. And the maidens showered them in abundance. Intoxicated by the first bottles of wine and becoming themselves again, having entered into their accustomed roles, they kissed their mustaches right and left, pinched their hands, emitted shrill shouts, and drank from all their glasses, singing French couplets and fragments of German songs they had learned in their daily intercourse with the enemy. Soon the men, intoxicated by this female body so accessible to their sense of smell and touch, went mad, began to roar, break dishes, while the soldiers standing behind each chair impassively served them. Only one major retained a certain restraint. Mademoiselle Fifi took Rachel on his lap. In his excitement, though he remained cold, he would kiss madly the black curls of her hair at the back of her head, breathing the tender warmth of her body and its smell between her dress and her skin, and then, seized by a bestial frenzy and a need for destruction, he would pinch her violently through her clothes, so that she would cry out. Often, too, holding her in his arms and squeezing her, as if trying to merge with her, he would dig his lips into the fresh mouth of the Jewess for a long time and kiss her until it took her breath away. And suddenly, at one of these moments, he bit the girl so deeply that a trickle of blood ran down her chin, dripping down her bodice. Once more she looked into the officer's eyes and, wiping the blood, muttered, "They pay for it." He burst out laughing cruelly. "I'll pay," he said. Dessert was served. They began to pour champagne. The commander rose and said in the same tone that he would have proclaimed a toast to the health of the Empress Augusta. "For our ladies." And so the toasts began, the gallant toasts of soldiers and drunkards, mixed with cynical jokes that seemed all the more rude because of their lack of knowledge of the language. The officers stood up one by one, trying to show off their wit, trying to be amusing, and the women, drunk to smithereens, with wandering eyes, with drooping lips, each time applauded furiously. The captain, wishing to give a festive and gallant character, raised his glass again and exclaimed, "For our victories over hearts." Then Lieutenant Otto, who looked like a black forest bear, stood up, excited, drunk, and in a burst of patriotism shouted, "For our victories over France." Drunk as they were, they fell silent at once, and Rachel turned around trembling. "Well, you know, I've seen Frenchmen in whose presence you wouldn't dare say that." But the little Marquis, still holding her on his knees, burst out laughing, amused by the wine. "Ha ha ha! I've never seen anything like it. As soon as we appear, they fly away as fast as they can." The enraged girl shouted right in his face, "You're lying, you scoundrel." For a moment he stared at her with his bright eyes, as he looked at paintings whose canvas was pierced by revolver shots. Then he laughed. "That's right. Well, let's talk about it, beauty. Would we have been here if they had been braver?" He perked up. "We are their masters. France is ours." With a jerk, Rachel slid off his lap and sank into her chair. He stood up, held out his glass over the table, and repeated, "We own all of France, all the French, all the forests, fields, and houses of France." The rest, completely drunk, seized with the enthusiasm of war, the enthusiasm of cattle, raised their glasses with a roar, "Long live Prussia!" and drained them in one gulp. The girls, forced to remain silent, frightened, did not protest. Rachel was silent too, unable to answer. The Marquis placed a glass of champagne on the Jewess's head, which had been filled again. "To us," he cried, "belong all the women of France." Rachel jumped up so quickly that the glass tipped over, as if performing a baptism. He poured yellow wine on her black hair and, falling to the floor, shattered. Her lips trembled. She looked defiantly at the officer, who was still laughing, and, choking with anger, babbled, "No, you're lying, that's no way. The women of France will never be yours." He sat down to laugh to his heart's content, and, imitating a Parisian pronunciation, said, "She's lovely, lovely. But why are you here, my baby?" Stunned, she fell silent at first, and in the agitation that seized her, she did not realize his words, but then, realizing what he was saying, she threw at him indignantly and furiously. I'm not a woman, I'm a whore, and that's what the Prussians need." Before she could finish speaking, he slapped her in the face with all his might, but the minute he raised his hand again, she snatched a silver-bladed dessert knife from the table, mad with rage, and stabbed it into the officer's neck so quickly that no one had time to notice it, at the very hollow where the chest begins. An unspoken word stuck in his throat, and he was left with his mouth open and a terrifying expression in his eyes. Everyone roared, and everyone jumped up in confusion. Rachel threw a chair at Lieutenant Otto's feet so that he sprawled to his full height, ran to the window, threw it open, and before they could catch her, jumped into the darkness where the rain did not stop. 2 minutes later, Mademoiselle Fifi was dead. Fritz and Otto drew their sabers and wanted to cut down the women who were lying at their feet. The major barely succeeded in preventing this slaughter, and he ordered the 4 maddened women to be locked up in a separate room, guarded by 2 sentinels. Then he put his detachment on alert and organized the pursuit of the fugitive, in full confidence that she would be caught. 50 people, threatened by threats, were sent to the park. 200 others searched the woods and all the houses in the valley. The table, from which everything had been instantly removed, now served as a deathbed, and 4 sober, implacable officers, with the stern faces of soldiers on duty, stood at the windows, trying to penetrate into the darkness. The terrible downpour continued. The darkness was filled with a continuous squelching, the roaring rustle of all the water that streamed from the sky, ran down the ground, fell in drops and splashed around. Suddenly a shot rang out, then another from afar, and for 4 hours from time to time there were heard shots near and far, muster signals, incomprehensible words shouted in hoarse voices and sounding like a call. By morning, everyone returned. 2 soldiers were killed and 3 others wounded by their comrades in the heat of the hunt and in the confusion of the night chase. Rachel was not found. Then the Prussians decided to strike fear into the inhabitants, turned all the houses upside down, drove around, searched, and turned the whole area upside down. The Jewess, it seemed, did not leave the slightest trace on her path. When this was reported to the general, he ordered the case to be extinguished so as not to set a bad example for the army, and imposed a disciplinary penalty on the major, who, in turn, warmed up his subordinates. "They don't fight to have fun and caress public girls," the general said. And Count von Falsberg, in extreme irritation, decided to take it all out on the district. As he needed some excuse to proceed with repression without hesitation, he summoned the cure and ordered him to ring the bell at the funeral of the Marquis von Eyrick. Contrary to all expectation, the priest this time turned out to be obedient, submissive, full of helpfulness. And when the body of Mademoiselle Fifi, carried by the soldiers, and in front of it, around and behind it were soldiers with loaded guns, when it left the castle of Heuville on its way to the churchyard, the death knell sounded for the first time from the bell tower, and the bell sounded somehow cheerful, as if it had been caressed by a friendly hand. He rang in the evening and the next day, and began to ring every day. He rang as much as was demanded of him. Sometimes it even began to sway lonely at night, and softly uttered 2 or 3 sounds in the darkness, as if it had woken up for some unknown reason and was seized with a strange gaiety. Then the local peasants decided that it was bewitched, and no one except the cure and sexton approached the bell tower. And up there, in anguish and loneliness, there lived an unfortunate girl who had taken food secretly from these 2 men. It remained on the bell tower until the departure of the German troops. Then, one evening, the cure asked for a charabanc from a baker and drove his captive to the gates of Rouen. Arriving there, the priest kissed her. She got out of the carriage and quickly walked to a brothel, the owner of which thought she was dead. Some time afterwards she was taken from there by a patriot, a stranger to prejudice, who loved her for this beautiful deed. Then later, when he fell in love with her for her own sake, he married her, and made of her a lady as good as many others. Friends, thank you for watching. Support the channel with subscriptions, comments, and a thumbs up. I am waiting for you at the next get-together with the book. Your narrator, Irene.